Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. This week, Vice President Kamala Harris announced that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz will be her running mate. Joining us now to tell us a little bit about Governor Walz is Representative Lisa Demuth. She is the House Minority Leader for Minnesota's legislature. Representative Demuth, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Maggie. It's nice to meet you, and thank you for having the conversation with me.
As I said before we started recording, you have a bit more familiarity with Governor Walz than the average American. You are the House Minority Leader for the Minnesota legislature. So I want to start with a very broad question. What is it like as a Republican to work with Governor Walz, who is a Democrat?
Well, thank you for the question. And I would say that Governor Walz, when he came in the 2019 session, he had campaigned up until that point on one Minnesota. And so we were working under divided government. In the House, the Republicans were in the minority. The Senate was held by Democrat majority, or I'm sorry, flipped the other way. Democrat majority in the House, Republican controlled Senate. And so we were looking at divided government. Campaigning on one Minnesota was very hopeful. We kind of all looked at that as a way to work together. What we discovered, though, is that it wasn't going to be like that. Through the first two sessions of divided government, it was very difficult. As I came in as leader in 2023, it was a full Democrat-controlled state. And I would say that Governor Walz did not want to work with Republicans.
What exactly does that mean? Can you explain or give some examples of of how that manifested in your experience?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, there were a couple of issues that were facing Minnesota, specifically nursing home funding. We had nursing homes that were underfunded that were closing. And so, as a new leader, the governor had invited the four legislative leaders to his residence for breakfast early in January. And so that conversation came up. My question was, could we look at nursing home funding and fixes earlier instead of waiting till the end of session? And he seemed very open to that. I was hopeful. That is not how the session played out. And as we got toward the end of May, toward the end of session, it looked like nothing was going to happen. So I reached out to his office and I said, this was a concern that we had. It seemed like we could have conversations. That hasn't taken place. Could I make an appointment with the governor? Made that appointment. It went from an in-person 15-minute meeting or 10-minute meeting to an online meeting. And then when I did get on that call, he was nowhere in the room. So he wouldn't even give 10 minutes on a topic that we had talked about of importance to one of the legislative leaders, me, and he wouldn't even give it that time. We could have rescheduled, but it just seemed like he was shifting that off. And so that was a surprise. I had never reached out to his office before individually. That was a little bit of a surprise. Fast forward to the end of the 24 session. And as we kind of came to a close, there was a 1,400-page bill that was passed in the House and the Senate within 10 minutes, right before the end of the legislative session. That bill was not available in print. That bill was not available on the Revisor website, yet the governor went ahead and signed that. Completely partisan. The negotiations around the end of session fell off. It was not meaningful. And it really seemed like when Republican votes weren't needed. And it's important to notice that the majority held by the Democrats in the state of Minnesota is very narrow. One person in the Senate, four members in the House. And so it was a very narrowly held majority, mostly controlled by our larger cities in the metropolitan Minneapolis-St. Paul area and the surrounding, not really spread out to greater Minnesota. I was surprised at his lack of unity and wanting to work together for the betterment of all Minnesotans. It was very partisan, and I was surprised by that.
That's interesting. You mentioned the bill was not available online. Is that a departure from prior Minnesota governors?
Absolutely. There, a number of years ago, under Republican control in the House, there was a very large bill that was passed, but at least it had been vetted at some point and it was available. This was not available in any way. Again, we have in our Constitution a single subject bill law, but yet that wasn't followed. It has been compromised other times, but this was egregious. And the shock that the governor then went ahead and signed that type of a bill into law was absolutely shocking.
Now, when you think about how a bill becomes a law, obviously you see lots of different legislation in the course of your job. If you have a concern over a specific piece of legislation, you use the nursing homes as an example. Is there another example of legislation where you had a concern and you and he had a dialogue and you were able to work through it? Or is there no record of that, in your opinion?
There is no record of that. Again, it seemed like Governor Walz did not want to work with Republicans. They had the votes to pass everything needed, and that's kind of what we saw. The other thing that's really important to point out is when we went into the legislative session in January of 23, our state had a record surplus. We had $18 billion of surplus in our state, expecting that that would be returned to the people of Minnesota, the taxpayers. That is something that the Democrats had really campaigned on. Governor Walz had said that they were going to attempt to return $2,000 checks to Minnesotans. That did not happen. And not only was that surplus not returned to the people of Minnesota, they increased the state budget by another $10 billion. And so we are at a record budget. It is not sustainable. We know in 2 to 3 years, we are facing a deficit as a state because of the ongoing spending. A couple of the other things that are most concerning are the education numbers. So our kids in the state of Minnesota, we used to be known for high quality education. Since Governor Walz came into office, and it's important to remember he's a former teacher. But when he came into office in 2019, our test scores in reading, math, and science have all dropped. We only have 47% of our kids reading at grade level. Math, they are not at grade level. Science, they are not at grade level. And our truancy rates have increased, meaning that only 69% of our kids are in school on a regular basis. And our graduation rates are stagnant at 83%. As a former teacher, I would have thought he would have come in and absolutely wanted to make changes in a positive way.
Those are interesting statistics, Representative Demuth. And I'm wondering, because a lot of his time in office has been during the pandemic and post-pandemic, and we have seen across the country lower test scores, higher truancy. I think it's a nationwide problem, if I may. So how do you think Minnesota's numbers compare nationally?
You know, it's important to recognize that the response to COVID, which obviously all of us, it was felt worldwide, but the response of different states and different leadership made positive and negative differences. Governor Walz shut down all of our schools, and then when they were finally allowed to reopen later in the fall of 2020, there was very difficult guidance given from the Department of Education as far as how it needed to happen. It was very confusing for school districts to follow. And the response again to COVID was a challenge. Again, I think test scores are very important to gauge where students are at. You know, obviously there was going to be a drop, but then we should have actually looked at ways to increase and really focus on the basics that we needed to, rather than putting different mandates on that would make it more difficult and a higher cost and budget concerns for schools across the state. That's what I'm hearing from superintendents right now, that they are looking at a budget that is not going to be able to be afforded, even though a lot of state dollars were put in.
Now, you've mentioned the budget, you've mentioned the record of working together. Just to zoom out, are there anything that you see as legislative accomplishments that Governor Walz has committed while he's in office?
You know, I think one other thing that I'd like to really mention with you, Maggie, is that this is not an accomplishment in a positive way, but there is record fraud in our state through different agencies and different departments. We have $250 million in fraud in something that was, it's feeding our future. The dollars were put out there to supposedly feed kids that were in challenging times during COVID, but there is record fraud that actually started in 2018. Now, the Feeding Our Future program was held under the Department of Education. And so that would have been a perfect time to realize that there was potential for fraud as he came in as governor, and he could have stopped that. But instead, the fraud went on. We have fraud within the Department of Education for that program. There's fraud in the frontline worker pay, which was dollars that were supposed to go for those that were working during the pandemic. $200 million out of a cap of $500 million was put out to fraudsters. We also know there's FBI investigation on autism spending, and then we have unemployment insurance fraud. So it's not an accomplishment to be proud of, but the concern with that is not a single government employee, commissioner or government employee under the watch of Governor Walz has been held accountable. Everybody still has their jobs. There have been no changes. And then piled on top of that, you look back at the pandemic earlier, the George Floyd murder, and then the protests that turned to riots. Our largest city in the state, Minneapolis, burned for 3 days before there was action from the governor's office.
On the matter of the fraud investigations, has the Minnesota House or Minnesota Senate called for investigations, and has he responded to that?
The OLA in Minnesota is the Office of Legislative Auditor. They are a nonpartisan office that actually looks at this. And so what has been pointed out is that there are not enough internal controls and that it is ripe for fraud. What we're seeing is fraud across different agencies, Department of Human Services, Minnesota Department of Education that I had talked about, Department of Labor and Industry, Department of Revenue. There is fraud all the way across there. And we are looking for legislative changes, but a full Democrat majority doesn't even want to report on it or talk about it right now.
Now, you mentioned George Floyd's murder, and I did want to ask you, how would you characterize Governor Walz's leadership in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and what you saw in Minnesota in those ensuing days and weeks?
It was a lack of response and a lack of timely response. We had, again, Minneapolis was burning for 3 days before Governor Walz took action. They allowed the 3rd police precinct to be burned to the ground. And I think that sent a message that if you were going to allow an establishment that is to provide order and peacekeeping within the area burned to the ground and then not rebuild it, that right there was a show of those that are protesting and then violently rioting, millions of dollars of damage throughout all of those businesses, people trying to protect them on their own because Governor Walz was nowhere to be found. We had news reporters locally that were saying, "Governor, where are you?" until he finally resurfaced again and took action. So it was a delayed response that never should have gotten as out of hand as it did.
A delayed response. Did he ever provide an explanation and or context for what happened in those days?
He did. There were some quotes that said that if it was a failure, it was on him, but yet it was past the point and there wasn't steps to rebuild and to reimagine that again. Again, the 3rd precinct should have been rebuilt immediately right where it is. I understand that's a city issue, that is a local control city issue, but the governor could have influence because it was unprecedented. And I think that set off a chain reaction negatively across our country and different things that you saw across the world too.
Now, in a lot of the press around Governor Walz this week, we've heard a lot about how he was able to hold on to his congressional seat in a district where Donald Trump otherwise dominated in 2016. So he seems to be being positioned as someone who could reach across the aisle or have broad appeal. What is your reaction to that kind of characterization of Governor Walz?
Governor Walz comes across as a very friendly and want to work together guy. When I talk about earlier in his campaign, the one Minnesota, I think that's it's something that people can get around. But the experience and then what he has actually passed into law does not line up with what we heard. And as I've talked about, he is very partisan focused rather than bipartisan focused. The things that he has signed into law are concerning. We know this presidential ticket between Harris and Walz is the most extreme ticket ever in the history because of the stance of where they have both been at on issues and the things that are being said going forward. We know that Governor Walz gave driver's license and free college, free healthcare to those that are in our state illegally. And we are all for legal immigration. I think that's an important thing. Clearly, it's a federal issue that needs to be taken care of. But if he is already going to do those things on a state level and providing that for those that are here illegally on the backs of taxpayers that are here legally and doing the right thing, I don't think that's a good direction for our state for sure, but definitely not for our country.
As you talk about the direction of the country, obviously Governor Walz is the second part of the ticket. He is the running mate, not the top of the ticket. So how do you think his leadership and the policies that we've been discussing will translate on a national level? Or maybe to put this a different way, how much effect do you think he would have on the top of the ticket?
I think what people need to do is, instead of just listening to the good sound bites that people hear, fact check it. Everything that I've given you, Maggie, is based on fact. You can prove the test scores from education, from the Department of Education, Minnesota Department of Education, their report card that they put out, as far as the votes that have taken, the bills that have been signed into law. That is all fact. It is not partisan. So as far as how would he affect the top of the ticket, if people fact check it, they would have grave concerns. One of the frustrating things in the state of Minnesota is the things that I've been talking about over the last 5 years that have happened. We've had little to none as far as media coverage on these. And the benefit of having this now raised to a national level is there is going to be some scrutiny, and Governor Walz is going to have to answer for this. And if he wants to actually become vice president, how do these things line up? But there has been little to none as far as the local media coverage on anything that sheds even a questionable light on his record.
Interesting. And
It,
Representative
yeah.
Demuth, you obviously are in Minnesota. What has been the reaction on the ground over the past few days? Obviously, this news is still very news. What are you hearing from constituents about his appointment as Kamala Harris's running mate?
The people that have kind of closed their minds to the fact that maybe some of his handling of things over the last 5.5 years could be problematic, those people are very excited for it. It is an honor to be chosen as a running mate, as vice president, and that is an honor there. But what we are hearing from those that are concerned about the business mandates that have been put on our businesses, the high taxes, the waste of dollars in Minnesota, the poor response to the riots, the questionable education outcomes for our kids here, they are very concerned about what that would translate into on a national level. So there's grave concern.
We're running down to our final minute. Any final words to our Forbes audience about Governor Walz and what to expect in the 2024 presidential election?
Well, thank you, Maggie. And again, thanks for the opportunity to talk about these things. Again, what I've mentioned is not partisan. It is not just one side against the other. It is fact, and people need to know that. How would he do this differently? Where would our state be if he had responded differently in a way that could help people succeed in their lives and not waste a surplus and not increase taxes and fees on Minnesotans? We would like to know how he would have done that differently and what would be different with him going into the White House.
How would you have done it differently? Just you mentioned the question, how it paint a picture for us. What's the alternate reality if he had not been governor?
Absolutely. Looking at that surplus, the $18 billion should have been returned to Minnesotans in a meaningful way. We needed definite investment in infrastructure, which we did pass a bonding bill last year. But infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, our wastewater treatment, those are ongoing things that could have been spent on. Instead, it was a number of those dollars were sent to unaccountable nonprofits, including the fraud that I've talked about. What we need to do is reduce the fraud. If there's fraud with one organization in one agency, that should be put on pause until there's verification. They should not be able to get money from other agencies. It's almost like they operate in silos. The commissioners of those agencies need to be held accountable before more dollars are given. Taking full responsibility of the challenges in education, making sure that the dollars that we are investing in education are going to be used as best needed with local control. There's been a focus on literacy, and there were dollars put out there to do a new program similar to the science of reading, but the READ Act is what the Democrats call it. What we've heard from superintendents across the state is that they want to invest in literacy, but the guidelines and the timelines that have been placed on them as mandates are not sustainable. They've had to pull teachers out for training out of the classroom, pay for substitute teachers, and trying to get caught up on this really narrow guideline. Again, the superintendents, the schools want kids to succeed, but they have to make it workable, and they're concerned about that. Some dollars were allocated for that training purpose, but it is a timeline that is not workable in most districts that this is going to be new for. Some that already had the program in place, they're a little bit further ahead. But again, that local control needed to happen. We legalized cannabis in our state, but yet the agency to oversee that, the Department of Cannabis, has had a failed director within, placed in position by Governor Walz and had to resign within 24 hours because of illegal activity prior to that time. We still don't have a good director. So it was energy mandates that came in that are going to make our energy unreliable and unaffordable, saying we'll pass this now, we'll figure it out later. That was the mentality over the last 2 years, and it is challenging. We want to respect our environment, to do the right things for the environment, but it has to be in a sustainable way. And so there was a lot of things that were just pushed through without real detailed thought going forward.
Representative, you have painted a vivid picture for us today. Minnesota House Minority Leader Lisa Demuth, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Maggie.